Question. Why are we doing this series? Anytime I start a series or start anything, I'd like to ask you, what's the purpose and what's the goal? What do we intend to find out? And so the question is, with the current events like they are with Gaza and Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, and the question is, and what they're chanting and what the protesters chant is, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. And what that means is that Israel will not exist. That's their goal, is for them not to exist. So I thought it would be a good idea for us to look at the land over there that we refer to as the Promised Land. And why it was the Promised Land is because it was promised to Abraham's descendants. And so I've been taking us through, we started back in Genesis with Abraham in this particular series to get us to follow it all the way through. So we're following through until we get to modern day, and who has a right to that land, who should be on that land, and why. And that's part of the thing that I'm trying to answer with that. And with that said, we're on lesson 5, and it's going to be Alexander, who's Alexander the Great, and the Greeks is the point in history I want us to go to. And so I want to back up, because it's been a couple of weeks since we've met together here, and we talked about the Persian Empire, and that's where we left off the last time. And this is a map of, you can find different maps showing different areas and so on. All of this colored area is where is the Persian Empire. You can't read this, I'm quite sure. If you can read this, your eyes are very good. But each color tells you at what time the Persians conquered that particular area and under which leader. Like the purple part here is under Cyrus in 550 BC, and it goes all the way down to the last territories, which is over there in Thrace, which was temporarily gained by Xerxes I. And so I want to follow through just a review of who they were and who the leaders were and the land that it covered, because down here is where Jerusalem, you see Jerusalem here, this is where the modern day state of Israel is today, and this is the land that was promised to Abraham, where he lived and where Sarah is buried, and Abraham is buried, and Isaac and Rebekah and many of the patriarchs buried there in that particular area that referred to as the Promised Land. And so at this particular point, if you remember, when we were talking about it last time, we're talking about when Cyrus came to power, and he instituted a policy, for lack of a better way to put it, of religious freedom for the different peoples, that you could practice your own religion. And he sent people back to Jerusalem to start rebuilding the city and start rebuilding the temple. When Nebuchadnezzar and his troops conquered Babylon, they tore the walls, from Babylon, the Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem, they tore the walls down. Why would they tear the walls down? Because in those days, if you had a city that did not have walls around it, all your enemies could just come right into town and kill whoever they wanted to, steal all of your stuff, and destroy it. So cities were built with walls. We know that today the walls would be useless. You don't build a city with walls around it anymore. But you would have your city, you'd have the walls around the city, and the Babylonians tore those walls down. And under the Persian Empire, they sent people back to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, and rebuild the walls around the city. And this just gives you a list. We started with Cyrus the Great, and then you have Cambyses II, Darius I, Xerxes I, and I got a note over here, Ahasuerus. If you're reading Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and you run across the name, I think in Ezra and Esther, of Ahasuerus, they think that was Xerxes I. And then you have Artaxerxes the first, Cyrus the younger, and then Darius the third. And that's where we are running through with the Persian Empire. And some of these names, like Artaxerxes, Xerxes, Ahasuerus, even Darius, some of these names, and Cyrus, some people, some historians contend that this wasn't as much names as it was titles. Some of it's the title, some of it's the name. That's not part of what we need to be discussing tonight. If it was, we get into it a little deeper, but it doesn't matter. All you know, when you're reading Ahasuerus, he was in the Ezra and Esther. It has to do with a ruler of the Persian Empire. So I start with the dates of when they went back. 535 BC. In Ezra 3, the temple work begins. They start rebuilding the temple. 534, the work was being hindered by different people around, and we'll talk about that if I can get a chance. 534 was Artaxerxes. He stopped all the work until he went back to find out the original declaration from Cyrus of what he intended. And then in 520 BC, the work resumed. In 515 BC, there's dedication of the temple. Tonight, I'm going to try to get us cover two things that we could do as two different lessons. I'm going to try to do it all in one because it'll be more cohesive that way. So if I run out of time, I'm not going to keep you here late. We'll just pick it up the next time. If not, we'll do something else the next time. So with that, I want to take us to Haggai, the first chapter, verse 7. It says, "The Lord of hosts says this, think carefully about your ways, go up into the hills, bring down lumber and build the house. Then I will be pleased with it and be glorified, says the Lord. You expected much, but then it amounted to little. When you brought the harvest to your house, I ruined it." Why? This is the declaration of the Lord of hosts, because my house still lies in ruins while each of you is busy with his own house. He's saying, get busy and build the temple, is what he's telling them, that they need to get the temple built. And you came back to rebuild the city and rebuild the temple, yet you haven't been really paying attention and building the temple like you should. And the temple that they built, this is one of the artist's renderings. There's many of them. I don't know that it was this elaborate in the way that they had to build it at a particular time. You can look, it would be named the Zerubbabel, Temple of Zerubbabel, and you'll see why in just a minute. But this is the second temple. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians when Nebuchadnezzar II came in and took them captive, and Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and many more took them captive into Babylon. They destroyed the temple. So the temple had to be rebuilt, and they rebuilt the temple as closely as possible to what they thought Solomon's temple looked like. Remember, this has been a good many years since this all occurred. Haggai 1:1 says, "In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through Haggai the prophet, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah." So this is who Zerubbabel was, and he was the one that oversaw this, and that's the reason they refer to it as the second temple, as Zerubbabel's temple, not because he planned it all and he built it all, but he was the one that was the governor at this particular time, and it tells us this here. So, who inhabited the land of Judea and Samaria during the time of building the second temple? So this is the list of some of the people that inhabited this area where Jerusalem is and where we call Israel today. There was the Jews that remained there. And if you remember from the last time, we kind of got an idea of numbers. There was more people left in this area than what they took captive into Babylon. Some of them fled to Egypt and so on, because the last time that it was called the diaspora. In other words, they were scattered throughout all different countries, but there was many of them that still left here. And so during this time, while the temple was being built, you have the Jews that returned from exile, naturally, up in the Persian Empire that was originally Babylon. And you have the Samaritans, which were a mix of Jews and the Assyrians. You remember the Assyrians moved the Jews, took some of the Jews out and moved them out of the land. Not all of them, but a good many of them out. And they sent people from different countries in here to re-inhabit this land. And the thought is that they wanted to stop these Jews from rebelling and causing them a hard time. So what he did was he sent people in to dilute the race. And if you're reading in the New Testament, you can see them referred to the Samaritans in a negative light. And one of the reasons they did was because they were considered mixed race. They were not pure Jew. But that's neither here nor there. The Phoenicians, people in Tyre and Sidon, we'll talk about them a little bit in just a minute. They were in this particular area, the northern coastal area of this region. And then Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem's people, these were three people that came in. This is the reason the work stopped on the temple when it did, is because they came in and complained, and they would do stuff. They harassed the Jews, tried to keep them from rebuilding the temple, and sent word back to Persia, to the king there, to get them to stop building the temple. And then I got the last line is a question mark. We don't know what kinds of people lived there at that particular time, because we don't have good records of the time to tell us, other than what we can read in the historical accounts, the archaeological accounts, and the biblical accounts, to get an idea of who was there. And all of this agrees with the archaeological findings and the history. Historians would tell you the same thing I have written here, not just Christians, not just Christian teachers. And I've got a map here. And again, this is something you can't see. Both of these are of the same thing. This shows what the land of Canaan, what we call the Promised Land. This is the way it divided up into peoples that were there. And you can see here, this was the people of Galilee, the people of Samaria. This is the people of Judah. It says Yehud there. Ashdod. This is where Gaza is today. And you can see the city of Gaza down there. Ashkelon, Ashdod, Jamnia, and all of these, which are were in this particular area called Ashdod. And Idumea, Moab, Ammon, Gilead. So you see, this was not a homogeneous group of people that were all the same at this particular time. It was not one country. It was several different regions at this particular time. This varied. One would get smaller, one would get larger, one would get wiped out, another one would come in, because this was a good period of time that was here. And this just shows you a different view of what you're looking at here. So this was the Samaria, which was the northern kingdom, northern 10 tribes, and Judah, which was Judah and Benjamin, the southern tribes under Israel. And that's the way they were at this particular time. Now I want to take us to the book of Maccabees. Book of Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, are in the Catholic Bible. They're not in our Bible. And there's reasons why, and I won't get into all that tonight, but there's 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees. If you read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, I think they're reliable historical documentation. 3rd and 4th Maccabees are more legend, and if you read it, if you read all four of those books back to back, you can tell there's a difference when you get the 3rd and 4th Maccabees, so it's not as historical. So I want to go back to the writing, because this was the writing of that particular day, and this can tell us a little bit about what we're looking at tonight. 1st Maccabees 1:1, it says, after Alexander. What Alexander? Alexander the Great. After Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius, and remember we saw the last Persian king was Darius. After he defeated King Darius and the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and slaughtered the kings of the earth. This is a picture of the Grecian Empire after he came back. Again, there's stuff on here that you can't see, but this gives you an idea of what kind of conqueror Alexander the Great was, because it starts over here in Thrace, which is up here. This is Macedonia in 336 BC is the dark green. And then the lighter green here is all the land that he conquered. And it has dates, it has years here. And you can see from about 330 and to like 332, 333, those few years, those few short years, he conquered all of this region. All of these. His armies went in there and conquered all of them, and he became king, and a guy was 30 years old. So he was a pretty powerful warrior. So the land of Canaan became part of the Grecian Empire. Instead of a separate nation, it was not a separate nation again. Remember, you saw the different areas, the way it was broken up, and it still didn't change much under the Grecian Empire, but it became part of the Grecian Empire. So, 1 Maccabees 1:5. It says, talking about Alexander the Great, it says, after this he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. So he summoned his most honored officers who had been brought up with him from youth and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander had reigned 12 years, he died. And here's what happened. This is not, there's other generals that wound up with land and stuff. These are the ones that's most, that we're interested in, and you'll see why in a minute. But see over here you have Lysimachus and Cassander. That would be in Greek and Turkey. That's the area they got. And then you have Seleucus, which is the biggest part of it, as one of the generals. And then down here is Ptolemy in Egypt. And you can see it's up through where Israel, Lebanon, part of Syria, and Jordan were all controlled by the Ptolemies. That changed back and forth over the years during this particular period in history because they would fight against each other. And here they were, they fought together as generals under Alexander the Great. Now they get to rule over their own kingdom. And so they got where they don't like their buddies anymore. And so as time went by, this switched back and forth. So this area that we're talking about as the Promised Land, which our course is talking about, as the Promised Land switched hands between control of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, which were up here in the northern part, and these down here in the southern part. Now, I want to switch gears for just a second, and you're going to think this is out of place, and I'm not going to tell you why, but I want to point out something while we're here. I want to talk about the Philistines. How many of you know any Philistines? How many of you have heard about any Philistines in your lifetime? Okay, we're going to talk about why in just a minute. This gives you an idea of what the area looked like with Israel and the kingdom of Judah, Edom, Moab, Ammon, and so on, all these different areas. But right here, this area in red is the land of Philistia. The Philistines lived here. And what's the most famous Philistine you know of? Goliath. What city was he from? He was from Gath, and you'll see that on one of our maps here in just a minute. But he was a Philistine. This little group of people here caused grief for everybody in the area. They were a warring group of people, and you can see why. Egypt lost its dominating position in, these are quotes. Some of these are quotes. I don't know who to attribute the quotes to because it didn't tell in the different documentation I looked up, but anyway, it's quotes. Egypt lost its dominating position in Canaan as general disorder overtook the Middle East in later 2nd millennia BC. So this is back before the time we're talking about now with Alexander and Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. The Canaanite city-states of the coast were subject to destructive attacks of the sea peoples. You see, I underlined that. And the reason being is because you'll see in just a minute, but the sea people that it talked about, historians don't know for sure who they are or who they were, where they came from, but they were a marauding group of people, kind of like the Vikings were coming down into Britain and so on back in history past. Anyway, this is the sea people came down here and they attacked the people who had previously devastated the coast of Asia Minor and other eastern Mediterranean. The northern Canaanite seaboard cities, Byblus, Tyre, and Sidon, survived these attacks and were soon flourishing as never before as dynamic centers of maritime trade. These cities became known to history as the Phoenicians. So when you hear the term Phoenicians, that's where they were. To their south, however, the Canaanite cities were destroyed, allowing one group of the sea peoples to settle the area. These were the Philistines. So this is where the Philistines came from. We can't track them back because there are different theories and ideas of where they came from, but I don't know if anybody can tell you for sure because records were terrible and they were not good record keepers themselves. So with archaeological findings and what we can trace down, we know it was these sea peoples that became the Philistines. There are 5 coastal cities, Gaza, Ascalon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, were to form a formidable confederacy in this area. So they all pulled together. It's hard for us to really picture this, but to a large degree, like in Greece, you had what you call city-states. In other words, the city, Macedonia, was a city and it was a state. And you had several of them, and Alexander the Great, his father, started pulling them under the one grouping, one heading of the Greeks, and Alexander finished the job after his dad was assassinated. So anyway, these that you see here are the Philistines. So I'll bring us back to 2 maps here of the Philistines. And in this one, here's the city of Gath, where Goliath was from. And over here's Ascalon and Ashdod. What's the other one? Gaza. Down here, the city. So Gaza was a city back then. It was not a region. It was a city at this particular time. And these arrows show the raids and stuff that they did during their this particular period of history. They were a rough group of people. So what happened to the Philistines? They lost their independence to the Assyrians in about 732 BC. Any dates that I give in this course are, you could put the little C in front of them that says circa. In other words, it's about. This is the best we can tell what the dates were. Anyway, they lost their independence at that particular time. And under Nebuchadnezzar, he conquered all of Syria and the kingdom of Judah, and the former Philistine cities became part of the Neo-Babylonian, in other words, the New Babylonian Empire. All traces of the Philistines as an ethnic group disappeared, and we have no record of them existing after about the 4th or 5th century BC. So we don't know what happened to them. They're just not there anymore. Why are we even talking about Philistines? Where was their nation? They're in the area where Gaza is today. And so they were the ones that they said they're the Palestinian people. And we'll talk about that as we go through the course here. So what happened to them? They got wiped out. So let's go back. Became Greece. All of this area, every bit of it, including what was Israel, what was Judea, all of Judea, what was the Philistia, every bit of that became part of the empire of the Grecian Empire. 1 Maccabees 1:1, after Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius and the Persians and the Medes. Of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and slaughtered the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. How would you be if you were the general who had conquered all of the known world for them, all of this particular area, had conquered all this in the short before he was ever 30 years old? You might be a little stuck on yourself too. Well, he was. I wanted to put in some dates here because all this has to do with our study. So just kind of put this in the back of your mind. These dates are what? They're estimates. We don't know for sure. So Abraham was about 2000 BC when he came to the Promised Land. Okay, Joseph, his time was about 1745. Moses in the Exodus was about 1500 BC. David, 1085 BC. I think 1007 is when he conquered Jerusalem, if I remember correctly, about that time. The monarchy was divided between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom about 1000 BC. The Assyrians destroyed Israel 722 BC. Babylonian captivity of Judah was 586 BC. And Persian conquest was 539 BC. Okay, so we're looking at the Promised Land from about 2000 down to 539, and then the Grecian conquest was about 330 BC, and the Grecian Empire was divided in about 323 BC. That gets us up where we're talking about tonight. This group of people, and it's important. There's an importance to this group of people and what they meant. So up to this point, who's been living in the land that is called the Promised Land? It was a mix of people. It was all different ones, but there never was a time during this particular period in history, all the way from Abraham to the time we're talking about, when there were no Jews in this area. They had continually been in this area from that time. People talk about who rightfully owns the land, who should be there, who shouldn't be. Just because it's in the past doesn't mean that it should be. But I'm saying for this period of time, which is what, 1600 years, there had been a Jewish presence in this land, either ruling it or living in this land up to this point. So, Seleucus the first. He was the one that was given the northern kingdom that you saw there, where Syria is, where Iran, Iraq, all that, Babylon, where that was. All that was given to him. When he died, Antiochus I took over, then Antiochus II, then Seleucus II, then Seleucus III, then Antiochus III the Great, his daughter was Cleopatra. Now don't get carried away. This is the wrong Cleopatra if you're thinking about Antony and Cleopatra. And I'll explain that in just a minute. And I've told you this before. I was taking a Bible course, and the guy that was teaching it he had a doctorate in divinity and very educated man. And we were talking about a particular period in history having to do with this area. And he said, and Cleopatra, who was the daughter of Antiochus III, he said, you know, Cleopatra, who Antony and Cleopatra, in my mind, I'm saying, you're 150 years off. You're on the wrong Cleopatra. The best I can figure, there was 7 Cleopatras. Okay, so this Cleopatra is not the one you think it is. Seleucus IV, and then Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He's the one that has to do with where we are tonight as well. So, to clear this up, I put that Cleopatra I was the daughter of Antiochus III and the wife of Ptolemy V. Who were the Ptolemies? The Ptolemies were down here in Egypt, all up into where we call the Promised Land, and the northern kingdom was the Seleucids. You had the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So they figured if Antiochus figured off, if I marry off one of my daughters to the leader, the king of Egypt, the Ptolemaic Empire down here, maybe we'll have some peace. It didn't work very long, but anyway, that's what they did. The Cleopatra VII, Thea, she was the one that you read about, Antony and Cleopatra. She was the mistress of Julius Caesar, had a son. His name was Caesarion. She was the wife of Mark Antony, and their children was Alexander Helios, Cleopatra II, Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. So they had several children together. What happened to this Cleopatra, to Antony and Cleopatra? She was the last pharaoh, if you will, of Egypt. They decided, they were under the Roman Empire, and Antony was part of the Roman Empire, and they decided they were going to reestablish their empire. And the Caesars came in, and people of Rome said, no, you're not. And they wound up committing suicide. So they died. She died fairly young. You can see from 70 BC to 30 BC is when the reason I'm mentioning her is because she was part of the connection. You know, talking to Kevin before we came in here, they're making a movie, or have made a movie about Cleopatra, and they have a black girl that's playing the part of Cleopatra. I don't have any problem. You can black, Mexican, it doesn't matter. But when you're talking about a historical character, as far as I'm concerned, you need to stick with historicity and stick with the history of it. Cleopatra was a Greek. She was not, from what I can see, had no blood at all from her bloodline that had anything. In fact, the Ptolemies were famous for marrying their brothers, the women marrying their brothers and sisters marrying back and forth. They didn't want to dilute their bloodline, so they married within the family, which created some problems naturally. And they killed each other and all kinds of things for power. It was a crazy time. So, but anyway, Cleopatra, did you think about it? Antony and Cleopatra, she was the last pharaoh, if you will, of Egypt. Which brings us to the point where I want to get to tonight. It's the Hasmonean Empire. Have you ever heard, or the Hasmonean dynasty, whichever you want to call it. Have you ever heard of that? Okay. I'm going to tell you something about it. You can see it about 167 BC through 37 BC is how long this empire lasted. If you look at the map, it's different colors. And the reason it's different colors is because this became part of the kingdom at different points under different people. Under the original revolt that we'll talk about in just a minute in the book of Maccabees, this was the area that was conquered around Jerusalem. Then if you look at the next one, the expansion under Jonathan, one of the Hasmoneans, one of the Maccabees, if you will, this was the areas that he added to the kingdom. The kingdom was expanding. Where is this area we're talking about? This is Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. What's here today? Israel. The nation of Israel. Okay. Then you see expansion under Simon. It goes down in Hyrcanus, and then under John, under Aristobulus I, up here, and down to the one named Alexander. So when they finished, before sometime within this 167 BC to 37 BC, all of this became part of a nation of Israel again. They had their independence from the Greeks at this particular time. Antiochus IV was never able, or anybody else was ever able to reconquer them. So they had, for this period of time, they were under their own rule again. Abraham's seed were under their own rule, under their own leadership in the land that was promised to Abraham. That's who the Hasmoneans were. And you can read about part of that in 1 Maccabees 1:20. And I like this story, so I'm going to read you this part of the story. After subduing Egypt, Antiochus turned back. So you see, Antiochus, who was of the Seleucid Empire, had conquered the Ptolemies down here in Egypt, and he was coming back, headed back up there, back in the 143rd year, and went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar and the lampstand for the light and all its utensils. Down in verse 41. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people and that all should give up their particular customs. In other words, we're going to all be one big happy family, but you're going to have to give up all your customs. You have to give up your religion, and that's going to be, can you see something? A problem. All the nations accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. Then in verse 44. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs. Now, at this particular time, they were still they had no longer under control of the Ptolemies. They were under control of the Seleucids from the northern kingdom. And the king sent letters, message to Judah, and so on. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices, and drink offerings in the sanctuary. In other words, do away with sacrifices, drink offerings, and all. I kind of broke that up, but that goes together. In the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the holy ones, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals. What did the Jews think of the pigs? What the Mosaic law tell them about pork? You don't eat it. You don't have it. They're not acceptable. Also, you can't eat oysters and scallops and shrimp and all that. So I'm glad I'm not an Orthodox Jew, because I like all that stuff. In fact, we had pork tonight before we came out here. Okay. Now, before we read any more, the Promised Land was part of the Grecian Empire. Under the Persians, the people of Jerusalem and surrounding areas had enjoyed limited autonomy. In other words, they could do about what they wanted to, they could worship who they wanted to, and they had a little bit of freedom, but that ended with the Grecian Empire. Antiochus IV Epiphanes had determined to undo all these Persian customs and to bring them all under one leadership and make them all serve him and serve his gods. So, now back to 1 Maccabees 2:1. In those days, Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the clan of Jorib, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modin. He had 5 sons: John surnamed Gadai, Simon, called Thassi, Judah, called Maccabeus, if that sounds familiar, book of Maccabees, Eleazar, called Avaran, and Jonathan, called Apphus. He saw the blasphemies being committed in Judah and Jerusalem. Mattathias was not happy about this. He saw what was going on. Verse 15, the king's officers who were enforcing the apostasies came to the town of Modin to make them offer sacrifices. The king sent his officers down there, said, you're going to make these people sacrifice. Many from Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. Then the king's officers spoke to Mattathias as follows. Here's what the officer told Mattathias. You are a leader, honored and great in this town, and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands. He said, you need to be the first one to come sacrifice a pig, basically, on the altar that we have set up. They built altars in the different cities, as all the nations and the people of Judah and those who are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king. And you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts. That'd be tempting, wouldn't it? You'll be the king's buddy, and you're going to get wealth and riches. You're going to get fame and all this. He didn't know who he was dealing with. But Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. He said, we're not going to do this, period. I don't care who says it. Then, he said, when he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modin, according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and slaughtered him. He killed this Jew on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. That might tick the old fellow off. Antiochus IV wouldn't like this, would he? So Antiochus sends his armies and so on to conquer them, and the Maccabees, the Hasmonean Empire, Hasmonean dynasty, they fought kind of a guerrilla warfare. They go up in the hills and they come down and attack them. And Antiochus and his armies never could conquer them. And the Jews took back over the land that was here, that was in Israel, from this powerful kingdom of the Seleucids, and rebuilt, cleaned up the altar, rebuilt the temple, started sacrificing again. What holiday comes out of this? What happened in Maccabees? Hanukkah. This is where Hanukkah came from, was this particular during the Hasmonean Empire. The legend is, some people say this is fable, some people say it's true. When they went in and cleansed the temple, they had the light that's supposed to, the lampstand that's supposed to burn 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's supposed to burn all the time. And they had enough oil to burn for one day. According to the legend, what happened was, and it would take that long to make some more oil from the olives to create enough olive oil to burn to keep the fire going. But miraculously, this flame continued to burn for 8 days. And that's the story that's told behind Hanukkah. Some Jews don't go with that story. Some do. I would say probably most of them say that, but we don't know if that's legend or true. But that's where the 8 days of Hanukkah came from. So they light a candle each day. You have a menorah has 7 branches, 3 on each side, 1 in the middle. Hanukkah menorah has 9. Has 8, 4 on each side, and 1 in the middle. The 1 in the middle is for a lighter to light each one of them as it comes that day. So they have 8 days of Hanukkah. Where we have 1 day of Christmas, they have 8 days. So I like the Jewish celebrations myself, where you can celebrate for a long time. So here we have the Jews once again ruling over the Promised Land. 167 to 137 BC. How many years is that? How good's your math? That's 130 years. So they ruled them. Up until this time, Jews have been living in this area, but they've been under different empires, under the Grecian Empire, under the Persian Empire, under the Babylonian Empire. They had been ruled by different ones at different times, but yet there were still Jews in the land. And then the Jews came back to the land under Cyrus, the Persian Empire. They came back to the land to rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls, which they did. And then the Hasmonean Empire was birthed out of a rebellion against the Seleucid Empire, which was part of the Grecian Empire, and they beat a force that was much bigger and more powerful than them. And so they were still living in this land, but at this particular time, up until 37 BC, they ruled themselves. What do you think happened? We're not going to get this tonight. But their rule ended in 37 BC. What kingdom came up around that time? What empire exploded across Rome? The Roman Empire, which brings us into the New Testament times. So we're going to be going from there next week. So I've about gotten through this. From the Babylonians in the 6th century BC until the Seleucids under Antiochus IV. In the 2nd century BC, the Jews had not ruled themselves. This all changed with the Hasmonean Empire. 12 tribes of Israel about 1406 BC. Assyrian conquest about 722. Babylonian conquest 597, 586 BC. There was the Babylonian Empire. They came in 597 and conquered Judea, conquered Jerusalem, and set up a vassal king. And he rebelled, and that's the reason they came back in 586. And that's when they tore everything down, tore the temple down. Persian conquest 539 BC. The Grecian conquest 332 BC, Hasmonean dynasty 140 BC, the 37 BC. So, from the time the 12 tribes came back until the end of the rule of the Hasmonean Empire or dynasty, that's a long time. Who was living in the land? Jews. Who was not living in the land? the Philistines were not living in the land, but if you bring it up in modern day, what people were not living in the land? There were no Palestinians living in the land. There was no such thing as a Palestinian up to this point in history. We're going to continue from here. But up until this point in history, there was no nation of Palestine. There were no Palestinian people. Nobody even knew had even heard of the name Palestine back during the Hasmonean dynasty. They didn't know anything about what that was, and that came about. And we'll talk about that next week. Is it next week? The next week is the ladies and men's meeting, so it'll be the next week. So, any questions? I got through all of that. I wanted to.